Hello class, and welcome to this chapter's lecture. In this lecture we're going to talk about conflict and negotiation. So let's get started. Conflict is defined as a process that begins when one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about. Now, this is really important. A couple key things you want to think about in this definition is that there's more than one party. Okay, so when to have conflict in the context that we're discussing it, you need at least two different parties, two different people. So within organizations, it could be a employee to a coworker, it could be a manager to employee, manager to upper level management. Either way it goes, there's more than one party in it, and that one party, one or more parties, perceives something as being valuable and important, and that the behavior or actions of the other party directly threatens that. In other words, there's something that they anticipate to be negative or to be harmful that one person perceives the other person's actions in being. Rooted very strongly in this definition is the idea of perception. So if you perceive someone's actions as being harmful, then there could be conflict. However, if for some reason you didn't perceive their actions as being harmful, then the idea of there being conflict reduces tremendously. Additionally, it also assumes that there's a focal area or focal component that someone cares about. And it is that because that care you have about that particular item, right? Let's say your paycheck, and you think that you're going to now not get your bonus that you were expecting to get at the end of the month. But because of your care of receiving that bonus, conflict can result. Now, if you had no care or concern about the bonus and whether you got more money or less money for your bonus, whether it came or didn't come, then there really would be no sense of conflict because you don't really care. So it's important to realize that so much of conflict is rooted psychologically, and it's rooted in the fact that there's perceptions that people have and that they maintain about the items that they choose to place value on and the behaviors of other people as it relates to those items. Okay, so that point of an ongoing activity when an interaction crosses over to become, interpersonal conflict. And bullet number 2 says encompasses a wide range of conflicts that people experience in organizations. Conflict can come in a variety of different forms. You could have two people who have different types of goals that they're trying to accomplish. You could have differences in how people interpret facts. And once again, it's not going to be conflict unless the parties in there have value in something, believe there's value in something that they want to keep and retain, use, or what have you, that they think somebody else is threatening. Okay, and then you can have disagreements on behavioral expectations. So this is where you may expect a person to behave or act one way and they don't, or vice versa. They expect you to behave in that one way and then you don't. Conflict can arise from that as well. The traditional view of conflict is that it's harmful. Conflict is harmful and it should always be avoided at any cost. This was the viewpoint that existed in the 1930s and 1940s. And you can see there would be a lot of problems that come from that. Namely, people could simply stick their head in the sand. Oh, there's a problem there. Turn around, go the other way. I don't want to deal with it. I want to just avoid it. Okay. Now, what this also is tied to is poor communication, lack of openness, and failure to respond to employee needs. Okay, because here's the problem: they want more money. I don't have more money to give it to them, so I'm going to avoid it. I'm just going to ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist. It's a very poor way of dealing with conflict, but this is the way that conflict was dealt with primarily in the 1930s and 1940s, at least from an academic theoretical perspective. They thought that this was a reasonable way of dealing with conflict. Another perspective on conflict is the human relations view of conflict. And this is the view that conflict is inevitable, it's natural, and it's going to take place in any group. Okay, this perspective was most widely accepted in the 1940s through the 1970s. The interactionist view also emerged, which is the belief that conflict is not only a positive force in a group, but it is absolutely necessary for the group to perform effectively. And this is the view that we maintain today. All right. Now, this view specifically states that if you got more than one person, you're going to have conflict at some point. You should just assume that's going to happen. But it is through conflict that performance can improve. Here's the idea, is that you have 2 people on a team. Let's say you have 5 people on a team, and they're all discussing how to handle a particular situation. One person makes a suggestion. Another person finds a problem with that suggestion. So the person who originally made that suggestion, person A, rethinks their position and comes back with it revised. They made some tweaks and changes to make their perspective better. Once again, now person C makes a negative comment. And then person A goes back, rethinks about it again, comes back with an even more improved perspective. What you have is the ongoing sharpening of ideas, and this is defined as conflict. But it could be functional conflict. It could be conflict that leads to a greater outcome, a more improved outcome. So with the current view of conflict, you have 2 perspectives. You have functional conflict and dysfunctional conflict. Functional conflict is any type of conflict or disagreement that leads to improvements in performance, whereas dysfunctional conflict is conflict that tends to hinder performance in an organization or performance of the team. We break down conflict in 3 different categories: task conflict, relationship conflict, and process conflict. Task conflict is conflict that is functional. It's conflict that disagrees on the tasks, the actions, the behaviors that we should take in order to address whatever situation that we are exploring at that particular time. Whatever the team is discussing, we're discussing how we're going to deal with it. What actions should we take? What behavior should we take? What resources should we get? We are talking about the task. And while we may disagree on what to do, we're going to work through those disagreements, and ultimately the idea that emerges at the end of the conflict situation when it's task conflict is better than the ideas that would have been selected at the beginning before conflict actually arose. So task conflict is deemed as being functional. Then you have relationship conflict. Relationship conflict is inherently dysfunctional. And this conflict focuses on personal relationships. So you're having conflict about a person's personal behaviors, their attitude, maybe the way they look, they dress, the way they talk, they speak. These are components of people that are inherently unique to an individual. And when you're arguing or disagreeing about those facts or about how someone thinks or about how someone looks, inevitably the conversation turns very personal. They will say comments back along that same level, and it turns into this very negative spiral that does not do anything to help push the ultimate goal forward. It does not increase performance. So relationship conflict is almost always dysfunctional. Next, you have process conflict. Process conflict is disagreements over the process on how something is going to be done. These are the steps we're going to take as individuals to actually complete the work. What are the process? What are the rules and the policies that we should put in place in our team that says this is how we interact with one another? This is how we solve the problem. This is how we move forward. We may disagree on the steps that we should take. So let's discuss that. Let's engage that conflict and figure out what our process, what our rules and procedures should be. That's process conflict. And process conflict is inherently functional. When you have a strong process, it helps you do better as a team. Next, let's take a quick look at the process that conflict undergoes. So whenever there is conflict, you can look at these 5 steps and kind of know that they've taken place in one way or another. Okay. So one is that there's some form of potential or actual incompatibility. So there's a disagreement of sorts. There's people that have different perspectives about something that they value. Okay. Step number 2 is cognition and personalization. This is when you rationalize it within your mind. So your perceptions are developed and you personalize it into yourself. Well, this is really my opinion, and this is how I see the situation. Third is intentions. So you're looking at what are the intentions of the individuals involved in the conflict? What are my intentions? What are the intentions of the other person? And how do they match up? Okay, because this could either lead to the conflict becoming relational conflict, or it could lead to it being process or task conflict. And the next is behavior. These are the actions that a person takes. And in this stage, you're looking at either the actions that you take and how someone else may respond to them, or the actions that someone else took and then how you're going to respond to them, or how some other party will respond to them. But we're actually looking at the physical behaviors that yourself and the others who are involved in the conflict situation exhibit. And the last stage are outcomes. What's the outcome of this conflict situation? Did it improve performance, or did it decrease performance? These are the 5 steps of the conflict process. Let's take a closer look at each step. Step number 1, we're talking about the potential opposition or incompatibility. So here you have communication, structure, and personal variables. All these are great sources for where incompatibility may arise. It can arise because of how someone communicates, their language. Maybe they're a poor communicator, maybe they're a strong communicator, maybe they have an accent, maybe there's just ways that they communicate that could lead to misunderstanding. There could be noise. Noise is anything that takes away from the message. It could be the structure of the job or the task that's going on. Is the reward system, leadership styles, membership goals, and compatibilities. And it also could be people's individual personality, their personal variables, such as your personality type, how you view things, your value systems that you believe in and follow. Under cognition and personalization, once again, you have basically perceived conflict and felt conflict. So perceived conflict is where your consciousness, your conscientiousness, how you perceive the situation, how you're personally interpreting it. So it's awareness by one or more parties of the existence of the conditions that create the opportunities to rise conflict. So it is how you rationalize the situation. The next, felt conflict, refers to the emotional component, because after all, every human is an emotional person as well. We have rational thought, but we also have an emotional part to us. So we can look at this situation and say, how do I feel about it? And a lot of times our feelings, or what we call felt conflict, our feelings can drive how we act, how we behave, and how we handle a particular conflict situation. Are you frustrated? Are you hostile? Do you have anxiety? So on and so forth. Stage number 3 is when we look at our intentions, decisions to act in a given way, and why. Why are you choosing to act or behave in a certain way? And note, you should also note that the behavior of a person does not always match up with their intentions. Right? So there's a saying that says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So sometimes people can engage in poor behavior but have the best of intentions. Okay, we do have a chart here that we use to understand conflict handling intentions. And if you look at it, this chart, you'll see that there's 2 axes, cooperativeness and assertiveness. So, and depending on how cooperative a person is, being very highly cooperative, or being very uncooperative, they'll fall somewhere on this axis. On the vertical axis, we have assertiveness, whether a person is very assertive, very direct, very challenging, very in your face, or very unassertive. They're very passive. Okay, they'll fall somewhere on that line. Now, depending on how a person behaves in terms of cooperativeness and assertiveness, there's typically one of 5 strategies that a person may engage in. And these strategies are competing, avoiding, accommodating, compromising, and collaborating. Now, when handling conflict, if a person is extremely aggressive and they're uncooperative, they're going to engage in a competing style. That's their intention. If the more I win, the more you lose. The more you win, the more I lose. So there's a definite competition. Avoiding, which is probably the worst strategy of all, would be uncooperative and they're unassertive. So they're not going to work with anybody else, but they also are not going to assert what they want. So they're going to avoid the problem. Another one here is cooperative, is accommodating, which is the person who's very cooperative, but they're not assertive. So they're just going to agree with whatever the other parties say. There's conflict going on. They're not going to stand up for themselves. They're just going to simply agree, which is also a pretty poor response to handling conflict. Not a desirable. So far we got avoiding and accommodating are not desirables. Competing, it can be good sometimes, but in general, not the best way to handle conflict. You have in the middle, we have compromising. So you're mildly assertive and you're mildly cooperative. So you're compromising. You're going to look at the situation and you're going to try to resolve it. Now, initially we would think compromising, that's a great solution. That's a good way to handle the conflict situation. But I would caution you to say, compromising, while it has some benefits, it also has some significant drawbacks. Whenever there's a conflict situation and you choose to handle it by compromising, it means that both parties are going to leave without getting something that they want or that they need. Both parties are going to have to give up something important so that the other party can get something that they want. So you're both going to have to compromise. And while it's effective sometimes, ideally you want to try to, if you can, get to collaborating. The collaborating is where you and the other party share information, you work together to try to ensure that all goals on both sides are met. Now, I know that's not always possible, but to what extent you can, you want to create that type of environment. In stage 4, we're looking at behavior. And what's important here to realize that your actions and behaviors send messages to other people who are involved in the conflict situation, as well as they send messages to you who are involved in the conflict situation. They're a reflection of your emotions, your perceptions. And if we look at it, there's an intensity continuum that we can view people's behaviors, such as no conflict at all, to other extreme, which would be you want to completely destroy and annihilate the other people that are involved in the conflict situation. So if you look here, you can see there's a continuum of no conflict to minor disagreements and understandings, and it can escalate up to assertive verbal attacks and threats and ultimatums, aggressive physical attacks, and then an effort to just really destroy the other party. Generally speaking, in business, it's okay to try to keep the conflict down to this level here, these two levels, where you can challenge or question other people, their thoughts or beliefs or assumptions, the facts or what have you, and you can have minor disagreements with people, all for the purpose of trying to work towards resolving the conflict. But in the business or work situation, when it escalates to verbal attacks or anything above that, more aggressively above that, it's generally a bad idea. So it's conflict in and of itself is something that's unpleasant for most people. Therefore, you don't want to engage in it just for the sake of engaging in it, and you certainly don't want to escalate it, because what most people perceive as being unpleasant are the really aggressive responses that come out of that. Here are some conflict resolution techniques. These are actions and behaviors that you can engage in when trying to deal with conflict. So one, and probably what I do the most, would be problem solving. Listen to all parties involved, understand your own personal situations and motives, and then try to actively work through the conflict and solve the problem, solve the places where the conflict and the disagreements may arise at. That's not the only technique, of course. You can use avoidance, you can use smoothing, compromising, authoritative command, altering structure of variables, communication. Any of these techniques, you play the devil's advocate. This is where you may take on the perspective that's different from yours, and you challenge that. Or if other persons are presenting their perspectives, you tell them in advance, I'm going to play the devil's advocate role, where you're going to try to actively find problems with their perspective or their beliefs or so on and so forth. But in that situation, it's good to tell the other person that that's the role you're going to play, so they don't attribute your behavior to you on some personal level, and then turn that what could be functional conflict into dysfunctional conflict. Here's some outcomes, stage 5, functional and dysfunctional conflict. If it's functional, you tend to have increases in performance. You have better decision making. It encourages people to be curious and to seek information, to work together. It creates an environment of self-evaluation and change. These are all very good things, and they help improve the progress and the successfulness of the group. Dysfunctional conflict can lead to discontent. It can lead to a host of negative emotions, increased anxiety. It can reduce the cohesiveness of the group and cause infighting, which could potentially break up the group. So it's very important that we try to keep all conflict situations functional. Now, let's talk about negotiation. So if you look at this lecture, you can almost look at it as two parts. The first part dealing with conflict, and the second half of this lecture dealing with negotiation. So let's get started. Negotiation is the process in which two or more parties exchange goods and services for some agreed upon rate, and presumably is to benefit both parties in one way or another. So two or more parties are coming into a situation. There's things that they want, there's things that they're willing to give, and now they're going to engage in conversation to try to maximize, if you will, whatever they can receive from the situation. There's two general approaches which are very important that you take note to: distributive bargaining and integrative bargaining. So distributive bargaining seeks to divide up the resources that are there. This is mine, this is yours. Distributive bargaining, underneath it, has the basic assumption that as things increase for me, as I get more, as I take more of this negotiation experience, you get less. As you take more, I get less. Therefore, the primary motive behind distributive bargaining is to get as much as you can, because it creates a win-lose perspective. It's a win-lose situation. I either won or I lost. I either got more resources than you or I didn't. I either got the most resources possible or I didn't. It's a very black and white perspective, and oftentimes the least effective when it comes to negotiating, while it's arguably the default perspective that many individuals go to. Integrative bargaining, however, seeks to find new solutions to the negotiation. It tries to add additional resources and facts and desires and wants into the negotiation equation so that hopefully both people can leave with what they want. And when we say a win-win situation here, it's important to note that we're not talking about a compromise. As noted before, in a compromise, both parties lose something that's very valuable and important to them. However, in a win-win situation, both parties leave with everything they want or they need. Or you may discover that something that you wanted is not actually what you needed throughout that negotiation process. So you may leave with something different than what you want, but what you have, you deem it to be equal or greater in value. So both parties truly leave with a win-win situation. Taking a closer look at distributive and integrative bargaining, you can see that distributive bargaining has what we call a fixed pie mindset. It means that the resources are fixed, they're not going to increase, and the more one person gets, the less another person gets. It creates a win-lose situation. Both parties are taking opposite positions. They do not share information because to give information about yourself, what you want, your resources, puts you at a disadvantage. So you don't want to do that. And it focuses on short-term relationships because it's inherently conflict-oriented. You go back to that chart about how we dealt with conflicts, and you'll see that competing is a particular style of dealing with conflict. Well, people who engage in the distributive perspective when it comes to negotiations, they by default go to competing. Whereas individuals who engage in the integrative approach to negotiations inherently lean toward collaborating. And once again, if you remember the difference I said between these two, in collaborating, we share information. We're trying to add new facts, new resources into whatever that conflict or negotiation situation is so we can truly create a win-win situation. This is the ultimate state of negotiation and ways of dealing with conflict, and that's where ultimately you want to be at. Once again, now looking at integrative bargaining, the goal for them is what we call the expanded pie mindset. So instead of it saying, oh, there's only $100 here, and the more you get of that $100, the less I get, and that's all we have. Integrative bargaining says, no, let's expand the conversation. So yeah, we have $100 cash, but I tell you what, I'm gonna put my computer in. I'm gonna throw in this printer as well. I'm putting in this desk. So now we've expanded the pie. So maybe you wanted to get as much cash as you could get because you wanted to buy office furniture. Well, now that there's some office furniture available to you, you can add that into the negotiation, and maybe you're willing to take $20 now because you have the computer, you have the desk, which are the things that you really wanted in the first place. And you can only get to that place because you're willing to share information. So let's take a closer look at that scenario. Two people are involved in a negotiation, and they're trying to negotiate how much they're going to charge for a particular service. So let's say I'm talking to a person who fixes computers, and he's saying, hey, it's going to be $200 for me to fix your computer. Now, I don't have $200, but I want my computer fixed. So we get into this negotiation. I say, well, my job in a distributive mindset is to get the price as low as possible and to have him take less. And his job is to get the price as high as possible. He wants to take as much as he can. So there we go, the terms of our negotiation. And we'll battle back and forth. And I say, well, I'll pay you 150. He says, pay me 200. Okay, well, 165. Okay, well, I'll take 190. And you kind of get back and forth. Either way, both parties are going to leave with something that they don't want. However, if that negotiation were approached with an integrative bargaining mindset, you're going to try to expand the pie. So the guy's like, okay, you want me to fix your computer? I tell you what, why don't you give me $200? And I see that you need a new graphics card. Your current graphics card is not very good. So I'll give you a free graphics card. I'm also going to put a mouse and a computer in there for free. And to him, it doesn't cost much at all because this equipment was just laying around. It wasn't going to be used for anything else. So he can give it at relatively low cost to himself. However, the other person who is trying to get the computer fixed, those are things that are incredibly valuable because if he were to go out to buy those items, they may cost another $200 for him to purchase. So all of a sudden now, instead of trying to negotiate the price, he's like, yeah, I think that's really great. I'll give you the whole 200. because we've now expanded the pie. I tell you what, I'll give you $210 if you could also throw in this larger monitor, for example. And the guy says, oh, well, the monitor, it's really worth this, and so on and so forth. Sure, I tell you, for $215, I'll throw the monitor in as well. So now the guy, he's getting more money, which is what he wanted. He's getting $215. And the other guy, he's getting more stuff that meets his other's basic underlying needs. Now, you could only have this type of situation develop, this way of negotiation and solving the conflict problem and dealing with it, if two people are willing to share information. So you can see that when it comes to information sharing, the integrative approach is very high. It focuses on the long term. If you needed more computer support, do you think that that individual will go back to the person he bought that fixed his computer? Absolutely. Because through that negotiation, they developed bonds of connectedness that said, hey, I'm really looking out for your best interest and my best interest. We both are looking out for what we want as individuals, but we're also looking out for what the other person wants. And we're going to try to make sure that both parties leave here happy. And that's someone that you can trust. It creates a high trust environment because both parties want everybody to win. Both parties share their interests, they share their positions, and they use that to build a new, unique situation that gives both parties what they want and what they need. So when you leave that negotiation, you leave better off than what you were when you came. So as you can see down here, this picture illustrates distributive is a fixed, limited set of resources. This is yours, this is mine. Integrative seeks to add additional components to the negotiation process, thereby making the pie larger. That's why we call it the expanding pie perspective. Let's take a closer look at negotiation. Now, there's a couple of tactics that you should be aware of. Distributive tactics, as we kind of mentioned earlier, they're aggressive. You want to make the first offer. You want to reveal a deadline, put pressure on that person to give you what you want and give it quick. Don't give them a lot of time to think about it. Those are distributive tactics. Integrative tactics, you may bargain in teams. Why teams? Because you want a greater variety of ideas. Someone may think of a way to add additional resources into that negotiation situation that another person may not. So it's really good to have it in teams. You want to put more issues on the table, and you don't want to compromise what you want. These are the things that I want and need. I'm not going to leave the table if I get all of them. But I'm willing to give some additional things that may help you be the same way. As a matter of fact, I'll go as far as to say, in the integrative approach, you don't want either side to compromise. You want either side instead to focus on saying, how can both parties get everything they want and they need? Okay, so that's what you call an integrative approach to bargaining. I want to take a closer look at the chart down here. Let's break it down. You got target A. This is a two-party negotiation. Party A and Party B. Party A, they have what they want. Let's say they want to buy a car, right? And they're willing to spend $5,000 for the car. So Party A, they want $5,000, which would be their target point, $5,000 for the car. And that $5,000 would be considered their target point right here. However, they're willing to settle for, the lowest they'll take the car for, they'll sell the car for would be $3,000. So that's their resistance point. So you should understand these terminology. Target point, $5,000 is what I want to sell the car for. Resistance point, $3,000. I'm not going to go below that part of that number. Now here comes Party B. They're coming into the dealership and they want to buy the car. They're looking to get a car. They want to pay no more than $4,000. No more than $4,000. That's Party B's resistance point. Their ideal price for the car, however, is $2,000. That's their target point. So they're coming in, they want to buy a car for $2,000, but they're willing to go up to $4,000. So it's important to understand the terminology and how this plays out. What you have here is a settlement range. That's the difference between the two resistance points. Party B is $4,000 what he or she is willing to pay, and Party A is $3,000 what he or she is willing to sell. As long as there's overlap, you have what's called a settlement range, and that settlement range is positive. As long as there's positive overlap, the odds that there could be some type of negotiation agreement is high. You can, however, have a situation where they don't, or the two items fail to overlap. Meaning that in this scenario would be Party A wants to sell the car, but they want to sell it for $5,000, but they're only willing to go down to $4,500. Party B comes in, they want to buy a car, and they're willing to spend no more than $3,000. But their ideal price is $2,000. In this case here, $4,500 and $3,000, there's no overlap between those particular price ranges, and the odds that those two individuals are going to come to a successful negotiation are pretty limited. So if there's a positive settlement range, the odds of coming to a solution, to an agreement, is pretty high. If there's a negative settlement range, the odds of coming to an agreement is pretty low. There's another concept you should be aware of. It's called BANTA. BANTA is an acronym, and it stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. It's important that whenever approaching any negotiation situation, that you have a BANTA. BANTA means that if this negotiation fails, if it doesn't work, what am I going to do? What's my alternative? So I want to go and I want to buy that car, but if I'm unsuccessful in negotiating the price to buy the car, and I can't do collaborative negotiations, the person's not, it's just not going to work, then what's your alternative? And maybe the alternative for you would be that you'll borrow your brother's car. That's your BANTA. So if I can't buy a car, I'm going to borrow my brother's car. He has an extra car. He'll let me borrow it for a couple months while I can continue to look and maybe find something different. So you have a BANTA. You have an alternative to a negotiated agreement. So if the agreement dissolves, it fails, what are you going to do? And it's important that in every negotiation situation, you walk in with a BANTA. Now, a lot of factors play into having a successful negotiation. Personality traits, people's moods and their emotions, their gender, all of those play into how successful a negotiation situation is. For example, extroverts, these are people who are agreeable, and they're not very good at distributive negotiations, but they'll be better at collaborative negotiations, right? Intelligence is also a weak indicator of how well a person could negotiate. If you think about it, sometimes the less intelligent you are, you don't understand all the facts, you simply continue to repeat what you want over and over and over again. That person may not be aware of even how unreasonable their request is because they're not intelligent enough to understand it. So, but they end up leaving with more resources than the person who's highly intelligent, who can understand all the intricacies of what's going on. So effectiveness in negotiation, you can't use intelligence as a proxy for that. The ability to show anger can help, particularly if it's distributive marketing. You can kind of intimidate or bully the person into giving up more resources. Positive moods can help, particularly when it comes to integrative, because you're trying to create an environment of happiness, of joy, of trustingness, and that, hey, this is all going to be greater than we possibly expected when we started this negotiation. Therefore, the moods are happy, the moods are high, very positive moods. Men and women tend to negotiate the same way, but experience different outcomes. A woman who comes in very assertive and aggressive may be perceived one way, whereas a man who comes in that same manner is perceived a different way. Therefore, they get different outcomes. Women and men tend to take on gender stereotype roles in negotiations, such as being tender and tough, the woman being the tender one, the male being the tough one. And women are actually less likely to negotiate. The general rule of thumb here is that women are oftentimes more likely to simply agree or acquiesce to the position as opposed to standing up and fighting. There are some other alternatives to negotiation in total, right? So one would be a mediator, an arbiter, a conciliator, and a consultant. These are all third-party negotiation roles that can be taking place. So a mediator is a neutral third party who facilitates negotiation by reasoning, persuasion, and suggesting alternatives. So the mediator is there to help guide the two parties or two or more parties through the conflict situation, through the negotiation. And they oftentimes think very creatively to try to help both parties leave with what they need. And if they can't leave what they need, to at least understand and arrive at some type of solution. An arbitrator, that's a third party to a negotiation who has the authority to dictate an agreement. So think about this person as a judge. So a lot of times judges take part-time work as arbitrators, where you have two or more parties coming in, they have a conflict situation or they're involved in a negotiation. All the facts and information are presented to the judge, and then the judge makes a decision. Now, this is not a court decision, but the two parties signed an agreement saying that they're willing to have it be a binding arbitration, meaning that whatever the judge rules is what they're going to stand by, is what they're going to be bound to. And you could also have an arbitrator that's not binding as well. Conciliator, this is a trusted third party who provides informal communication between the negotiator and his or her opponent. This is a person that just kind of passes information back and forth. They're just trying to help. They're not official. They may be somebody that both sides respect and recognize, and they're just trying to help the situation be smoothed over by passing information. Sometimes you can have a situation where you got two people who are they don't have very strong relationships. They're very negative, a lot of conflict, arguing and fighting. Think about a marriage couple, going through a divorce. You may have a person that passes information between both parties because both parties don't even want to be in the same room with each other. And then lastly is a consultant. This is an impartial third party who's skilled at conflict management, who attempts to facilitate creative problem solving through communication and analysis. So this is someone who's trained in business or what have you. They're looking at the situation. They're just trying to come up with creative solutions for all the parties that are involved. How negotiations are handled, how conflict is handled, can also differ significantly by country. Japanese and the U.S. managers view conflict very, very differently. United States are very head-on, very kind of in your face. U.S. managers are more likely to use competing tactics, while Japanese managers are more likely to use compromise or even avoidance as tactics. Multiple cross-cultural studies on negotiations and styles show that American negotiators are more likely than Japanese to make the first offer. North Americans use facts to persuade people. Arabs use emotions, and Russians use aggressiveness, or they try to assert their ideals. Brazilians say no far more often than Americans and Japanese. But no doesn't always mean no. So understanding when no means no and when no means yes is also an important part of negotiation as well. So in summary, conflict can be both constructive and destructive. You want to try to focus on having a collaborative style of dealing with conflict if you can. Otherwise, go to competition or accommodation or compromise, one of the two, whichever is most useful for you. In general, try to avoid avoidance. And then integrative negotiation tactics are far more appropriate for building long-term relationships than distributive tactics for negotiation. That wraps it up for this lecture. If you have any questions, be sure to send me an email, and you have a great day. Thank you very much.